Thank you again for listening to the History of the Papacy podcast. I am your host, Steve. I want to quickly mention again that I have relaunched the Beyond the Big Screen podcast as a part of Scott Rank's new podcast network, of which the History of the Papacy is also a member. I really think you'll enjoy Beyond the Big Screen. So please take a listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or the podcatcher of your choice. If you like what you hear, I would definitely appreciate you leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. I would like to quickly tell you about the History of the Papacy on Patreon, the History of the Papacy, which can be found at patreon.com/history of the papacy. There's 4 tiers representing each of the traditional patriarchates of Christianity, including Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. The biggest thing is you will not only be supporting the podcast, but you will also be included in the History of the Papacy diptychs. And in traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the list of bishops that are read in order. So if you want to get in on the list early, you got to sign up now. And I would just really appreciate your support and help in keeping this whole operation going. So I definitely ask for your help. So let us commemorate the Patreons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, and John at the Alexandria level. We have Dapo, Paul, Justin, and Lana, who are all magnificent at Constantinople, and then reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great. Now, a bittersweet moment for the History of the Papacy. We are wrapping up our series on the 12 minor prophets that we co-hosted with Garry Stevens. We've been working on this 12 minor prophets series for over a year at this point. They've only been being released for about a little 3 months-ish, but with recording between Australia time and US time and all of that, it took a long time, and planning and researching and all of that took a long time. But today, what we're going to do is, in the last a couple episodes ago, Garry and I made our case for our top 12 minor prophets. So today we finally entered the big leagues. We're being joined by scholar of the 12 minor prophets and talented linguist, Baylor University's own Dr. Kipp Swinney. And he's going to discuss the definitive top 12, his top 12. You know, he couldn't choose exactly. He said he loves all the 12, but he's going to kind of tell us a little bit more about each of these prophets in a new way, and a new academic and scholarly way, and the kind of the cutting edge of the 12 prophets. So I definitely think you're going to enjoy. I want to thank Dr. Swinney so much for joining us and giving us so much of his time to answer so many questions and to discuss all these great topics. And I want to, of course, thank you for listening. And with that, here's another piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Welcome back to the final, possibly final, more than likely final episode in the 12 Prophets series of the Old Testament with Garry Stevens of the History in the Bible podcast and I, Steve, of the History of the Papacy podcast. Today, we are joined by Professor Kipp Swinney of Baylor University in Waco, Texas. Professor Swinney holds a PhD in religion from Baylor, has written numerous articles, and knows a list of languages longer than my arm. We are very excited to have Professor Swinney on the show to help Garry and I wrap up this series and teach us a thing or two or 20 on the 12. Professor Swinney, do you Kipp, Professor Swinney?
You may absolutely call me Kipp. I tell my students that they can call me Kipp as long as my dean's not in the room. Okay. But if my dean's in the room, they better call me Dr. Swinney.
All right. We're like to be a little laid back here. Kipp, can you maybe tell us a bit about yourself and how you got interested in the 12 prophets?
Yeah, so I took a course on prophetic literature when I was in undergrad, and I was a Bible major as an undergraduate student, and so I thought I probably knew the Bible pretty well at that point. But the course on prophetic literature really opened up the prophets in general, and in particular the Book of the 12, in ways I didn't think possible. There's a whole wealth there that I just had no idea existed. I was also learning Hebrew at the same time. And kind of a rite of passage of first-year Hebrew students is to translate the book of Jonah. And so we were, in Hebrew, we were working on one of the 12, and in my prophets class, we were working on all of the 12. And it was a wonderful experience, and it set me on the trajectory that I've really been on for my life up to this point from then.
So today we're going to just kind of discuss, Garry and I in the last episode, we put our 12 in a list and we kind of combined our two lists, and we want to run through your top 12 list. And I think we'll have a lot of questions as we go about the 12 and maybe how you came about your listing. Now, let's maybe start off right at the bottom and talk about Obadiah. Garry and I rated Obadiah at the bottom, and so did you. Can maybe tell us a little bit about Obadiah from your perspective and why you've put Obadiah at the bottom?
Well, I have to admit, it was hard making these rankings and I just kind of had to do it off the cuff a little bit and not analyze it too carefully. Obadiah went to the bottom just because it's short. It doesn't have a lot to say. And I mean, it's all about those Edomites, It doesn't have a lot of deep, impactful language either for ancient readers or modern ones. And so even though I still appreciate some of what Obadiah is trying to do, it has an important piece in the broader 12. It went to the last on my ranking because I'm not really going to go out and recommend people read Obadiah.
How do you think Obadiah made the cut in such a short book? Mm-hmm. It's only a couple of lines, and it is really about such a specific issue. What was maybe the context of Obadiah?
The context of Obadiah is definitely in the wake of the Babylonian capture of Jerusalem. Quite a bit of Obadiah also appears in Jeremiah, and pretty likely that Obadiah is borrowing from Jeremiah and not the reverse. So that actually gives you a little bit of context for when it could be temporally. It's got to be after Jeremiah. And so Obadiah is, lambasting the Edomites and we know very little about this. This is only kind of reconstructed through the text. Apparently the Edomites either facilitated or in some way assisted the Babylonians in their destruction of Jerusalem, but very little is known about it in general. But whatever they did, that's kind of the backdrop for Obadiah. Of course, Obadiah being, Edom being connected to Esau and the national narratives. Edom is actually kind of considered to be a close cousin of Israel and Judah, even to the point where Deuteronomy 23 gives these Edomites a special cultic status. They're allowed to enter into the assembly where other foreign nations are not. So, Obadiah, the betrayal of the Edomites hurts because it's kind of a cousin, but obviously there's lots of bad blood between Edom and Judah as well. So it's not entirely surprising.
So let's move on. Let's leave Obadiah in the dust and move on to your next was Nahum. We came up with Hosea next, but we'll leave Hosea because he ranked quite a bit higher on your list. Let's talk a little bit about Nahum. Who is Nahum and a little bit about his book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't really know much about Nahum. Nahum depends on how you say it. In Hebrew would be Nahum. It calls him the Elkoshite in the opening of the book. And there's been all kinds of speculation about what that means. Nobody knows for sure. The context of Nahum indicates that it's sometime before 612 BCE, because it's supposed to be foretelling the destruction of Nineveh. And there's actually some good reasons to think that maybe it was written before that event, because he gets some key details wrong about the way that Nineveh actually fell. So it's entirely possible that it was written before the fall of Nineveh, not afterwards, what we would call a prophecy ex eventua or vaticina ex eventua. Some people will come out and say, yes, Nahum is after the fact. But because of some of those key details being incorrect about the fall of Nineveh, probably at least a good chunk of the book was indeed written before 612. Presumably it was written in Judah, though the only way you know that is because it appears in the Hebrew Bible and it makes reference to Yahweh. So most plausible, we have sometime in the 7th century. It references the fall of Thebes, which happens in the 660s. So that gives you kind of a range, somewhere between 660 BC and 612 BCE. Probably in Judah, though again, that's a very good guess, but it's still a guess. Clearly he doesn't like Nineveh or the Assyrians much at all, which not many people did, of course.
No, not high on anyone's popularity list, I would have thought, the Assyrians.
So Nahum, would you say he's hit on, and forgive us for our pronunciations of any of these books.
No worries.
So Nahum, I think he ranked a little bit higher on our list. On our list, Nahum he wasn't spectacular, but that book wasn't really bad either. It was okay.
Mm-hmm.
How would you, I mean, obviously all of these rankings are just a little artificial but more for fun. Why would he just off the top of your head rank more towards the bottom than say some other books?
Well, once again, it's kind of got the same problem as Obadiah. Now, if you were to ask me to rank these books in terms of their literary quality, Nahum goes way up the list because his poetry is actually quite excellent. Some people will make the claim that it's some of the highest quality poetry in the Hebrew Bible. I don't quite agree with that, but it is very high quality stuff. But ultimately, the whole book is kind of geared towards bashing Nineveh, and there's not a whole lot more than that in the end, though it does kind of give you it plays this part in the 12 where we're kind of exploring Yahweh's role with the nations. Is Yahweh Lord over the other nations? And Nahum kind of gives an affirmative, yes, Yahweh is Lord of the other nations as well.
Next up, you had Haggai, and they have a very specific and particular context, which is fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Haggai, he's actually buddies with Zechariah, right? He appears kind of in tandem in the book of Ezra with Zechariah, and uses the same dating formula, appears to be from the same context. Haggai appears to be in the context that the people have returned from Babylon, so we're sometime into the Persian period, and something that you can kind of catch if you read between the lines in the Book of the 12 and in the other parts of the Bible, but it can be confirmed by geologists. There was actually a pretty significant famine going on in Yehud during this time, Yehud being the Persian province of Judah. And so it was a rough time for the people. And so I kind of sometimes have a little bit of sympathy for the people whom Haggai is calling out, because they've come back to Yehud, this tiny little province. They're experiencing drought, famine, and Haggai is getting on to them for not rebuilding the temple. But apparently the prophecy of both Haggai and Zechariah really gets people motivated because they commence again in the temple.
Now, Haggai and Zechariah form a pair, really, as you say,
Yeah.
because they're writing the same time.
Yes.
But you rated Zechariah much higher than Haggai's baby.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is length, right? Zechariah has a lot more time to say important things. But yes, I do think much more highly of Zechariah. Zechariah is, there's a lot more literary quality there. And the imagery of Zechariah, though it's kind of, some people have a hard time with it. It's actually kind of the forerunner to the book of Revelation. One of them. And so a lot of these images, like the lampstand, that's borrowed directly, the measuring of Jerusalem, these sorts of things, which is also has a commonality with Ezekiel. So, but yeah, Zechariah. Should I go to Zephaniah or Zechariah next?
We're on a roll. Let's talk, because they are they do have hit those same themes. Maybe let's talk about them.
Yeah. So Zechariah really is participating in this, and I should pause and say, Zechariah fits into two neat parts. Zechariah 1 through 8 goes with Haggai. Once you get to Zechariah 9, things are completely different. Zechariah 9 through 14 is a collection of oracles that doesn't necessarily seem to connect to the rest of the book. But Zechariah 1 through 8 is actually participating in a larger conversation that's going on in Judah, Yehud, during the early Persian period. Actually, it goes on a long time. And it has to do with Yahweh's relationship, once again, to the nations. Whereas earlier you have the answer is, Yahweh's gonna obliterate the nations, right? That's Nahum's answer. But Zechariah has a different perspective on it. And so you see this both Zechariah 2, Zechariah 8, where there's this universal element to Zechariah, kind of in conflict with other parts of the Hebrew Bible. And so Zechariah also has a strong element of social justice. You can see that in Zechariah 7 as well. Has some connections between that and Isaiah 58, where essentially they say, your religiosity has prevented you from doing justice. And so God wants none of your religiosity, because you are using it as a cover for your oppression of the poor and widows and foreigners. I think I was kind of surprised how low y'all put Zechariah on your list, but that's part of why we do this, right?
Okay, well, on to Zephaniah. I can't remember anything about Zephaniah at the minute.
The book identifies itself as being during the reign, as famous for all of his reforms. And it appears that, there's a big debate about whether or not Zephaniah is preaching before or after the reforms of Josiah. It might be both. But he goes off on, all of the foreign influences in particular in Zephaniah 1. Then he goes off on all of the foreigners that aren't there in Judah. He goes off on the Philistines and the Assyrians and those kinds of folks in chapter 2. And chapter 3 is kind of a flip from chapter 2. Chapter 3, which is it's actually quite complex Hebrew. It's got some parts that are so difficult to read that a lot of translators or commenters will just say, just ignore this because you can't translate it. But it has a kind of universal perspective that seems to be almost contrary to the first part of chapters 1 and chapter 2, really. It all seems to be tied together by these kind of references to Genesis. It's got these kind of sprinkled throughout. It begins with kind of a reference to the creation story in Genesis 1 by inverting the creation, where Yahweh's going to wipe away everything, and then it walks through walks through everything backwards from how Genesis, how everything is created. Then in chapter 3, you get similar kinds of references to Genesis 1 through 11, except that they're positive reversals. And so you have their speech is made pure rather than there's, the Tower of Babel story where speech is just garbled and muddled and everything. And everything is kind of turning out to be good in the last few verses of Zephaniah, promising a return from exile. Probably the only text that is read from Zephaniah on any kind of regularity is Zephaniah 3:17, where Yahweh is singing over Judah with rejoicing and quieting Judah with his love. And so if you're going to find a bumper sticker of Zephaniah, it's going to be that right there. So lots of condemnation followed up by this kind of reversal of everything in Zephaniah 3.
There's a lot of those interesting inversions in the 12.
Absolutely.
What are maybe some other examples of the inversions, and maybe why do you think that that sort of wordplay and metaphor was included?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a rhetorical move. Probably one of the most significant of these inversions, Amos 3, where the prophet speaking for Yahweh says to Israel, "You have I only known of all the nations on the earth," and alludes to the experience of coming out of Egypt and that sort of thing. So, he's setting them up for, we're on good terms here. And then all of a sudden he flips it. "Yes, you have only I known from all the families of the earth. Therefore, I'm going to punish you double because you should have done better," in that sense. That's the thing. A lot of these prophets are meant to be heard aloud. And so these inversions are to make their point stick. They're rhetorical tactics to really get to the heart of their listeners. And Amos is probably the master of rhetoric in terms of the 12. He's a very good rhetorician compared to some of the others, at least.
Now, Habakkuk, I don't know. I always got stuck with Habakkuk on the HMS Habakkuk from World War II.
I enjoyed that. I knew nothing about that before I listened to the podcast.
At least we got a little something right along the way. Hopefully we got it right. But let's talk a little bit about Habakkuk, and what do you think about him and how he fits in with the whole 12?
Mm-hmm. So, Habakkuk, I tend to say Habakkuk, but Habakkuk is actually a little bit better, the pronunciation, Habakkuk. So he is actually right there in tandem with Nahum. There's a lot of corollaries between Habakkuk and Nahum, and they are right next to each other in the 12. Nahum, of course, addresses Assyria and Nineveh. Habakkuk addresses the Babylonian crisis. And it's really a fascinating text, and y'all talked about this a little bit. It opens up as a dialogue between the prophet and God about the evils that are going on in Judah, and basically God says, "Well, you think this is evil? Just wait till the Babylonians get here. It's going to be worse." Habakkuk is not. That's not the answer he was wanting. But Habakkuk 3 is just this fascinating text. I think the whole book of Habakkuk is very fascinating. I was kind of surprised at how low it ended up on my list when I was done. But Habakkuk 3 is a psalm, which is kind of weird in of itself because it's not in the book of Psalms, but it self-identifies as a psalm or a prayer, and it has these other devices in there. Like it's the only place where the Selah notation that you sometimes see in the book of Psalms. It also appears in Habakkuk 3. That's the only other place where that appears. And so it's in there 3 times, and it has a lot of similarity to Psalm 77. It has some potential almost quotation of Psalm 18 as well. So it's got a lot of relationship to the Psalms in general. It is very difficult Hebrew, extraordinarily difficult Hebrew. Some people say it's archaic Hebrew. It just depends on what side of the debate you want to land on, which makes some people think it's extraordinarily old, even older than the prophet Habakkuk himself. He's kind of using something that's older than he is. But of course, you have lots of different opinions on it. The thing that I find so interesting about Habakkuk, and this does not come through in the English translations at all, is how aware of the various mythological traditions Habakkuk is. You can spot this a little bit in some English translations, but a lot of deities get referenced in Habakkuk 3.
Really?
Resheph is one that's right in front of me. I think it's about in verse 5, 3 verse 5, somewhere in there. Resheph is this common deity. It might call it plague or pestilence. The deep is mentioned. This is a reference to the Tiamat monster that you find in Enuma Elish. And a variety of other deities appear in addition to Yahweh, who is way stronger and way mightier than any of them. The most significant kind of, I don't know if you want to call them foreign deities, sea and river are personified, and you see that Yahweh's trampling on the sea. These are the kind of nemesis of Baal in some of the Canaanite traditions about Baal going to fight against sea and river and that sort of thing. And Yahweh shows up, and it's hardly a contest. Yahweh just kind of runs over them. It's not.
Yeah, I'm just looking at Habakkuk 3:8.
Yeah.
And yes, it's very sort of Mesopotamian, isn't it?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Really?
Mm-hmm. There are references.
Are you wroth, O Lord, with Nahum? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, so that's river.
Yeah. Is your anger against Nahum, your rage against Yam?
Yam is sea. Uh-huh. Yep.
Yam.
Those are deities, and it's both river, sea, and the deity that go by those names at the same time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the things that, as somebody who I didn't read them with any sort of explanation texts, at least my first run through, and a lot of things in these, it felt like you needed a lot of explanatory text to get what they were talking about.
That's definitely true in Habakkuk 3, because there's so many references, and you really need to be quite familiar with some of the mythological literature from the surrounding nations in order to catch these.
So next up we have on your list is Malachi. Malachi is really interesting in that he is the last book in the Old Testament. So what do you think about Malachi, and what was his book about?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about Malachi is that may not be the guy's name. Malachi Malachi just means my messenger. And so there's lots of speculation about whether or not this is a name or a title, my messenger. Also dealing with the late Persian era, and is coming into conflict, apparently, with some of the same things that are some of the reforms of Nehemiah. Where Nehemiah and Ezra, they're also part of this larger conversation. They're making all of these native-born Judeans divorce wives who were of foreign descent and that sort of thing. And Malachi has a hard time with this, because he doesn't want the foreign influence, but he also comes down on God doesn't want people to be divorcing their wives left and right, like Ezra and Nehemiah have kind of made people do. But there's a few just really golden texts in Malachi, where some people have kind of heralded it as a forward thinking in the way that they view human nature, because it says, I think it's Malachi 2. Oh, I should have it in front of me, somewhere around 2:14. That may not be the right verse. where he says, don't we all have God as our Father? Why then are we faithless to each other? And this is kind of along the road to equality. I mean, we're not quite there, but if we all have God as our Father, then how can we justify treating each other faithlessly? So Malachi's got a few gems in there, but by and large, there's a lot of Malachi that's not quite as pleasant. I'll just say.
I think Malachi, for me, brought up an issue of how the whole Bible is organized, because Malachi is clearly not the last written, but it's the last book in your Bible. And there just doesn't seem to be a good transition between Malachi and Mark 1.
Mm-hmm. Or Matthew 1.
Or Matthew. Yeah, Matthew. Sorry, I'll edit that one out.
Yeah.
There doesn't seem to be a good transition from Malachi to Mark 1.
Matthew 1.
Oh, my goodness.
Well,
maybe we'll keep that in.
So there's actually a lot of discussion about the organization of the Christian Bible versus the Jewish Bible. Malachi is not the last book, according to the Jewish organization. That would be Chronicles or Second Chronicles. Of course, it's only one book in the Jewish tradition. But Malachi being last in the Christian tradition actually does have an interesting point, because it's some of the texts that people use to say John the Baptist is the Elijah that's coming in those gospel texts. And so we're referring back to Malachi because of that. And so that does actually have a little bit of a transitional aspect where you end the Old Testament by reading these texts about the Elijah who is to come, and then the Gospels proclaim that John the Baptist is this Elijah. So you're right; it's still quite a transition there. But it does. I don't know if it was a grand design, and when the Septuagint was being put together, I doubt it. But that's how it's become used in Christian traditions.
I guess that also lends itself of organization to why these 12 books put together, because they're written so far apart from each other chronologically. Mm-hmm. They have a lot of different themes. How did these 12 get condensed into one section?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, there's a lot of editing that brought them together. They didn't just, all of a sudden plop down together on the same scroll, though they're almost always recorded on one scroll. And so they do have a lot of relationship to each other. I think length does have something to play with it, because you probably had some of these smaller books were recorded on a single scroll just because they were short. In fact, you have an Isaiah scroll, an Ezekiel scroll, a Jeremiah scroll, and a scroll of the 12, and they're all roughly about the same length. And so some of it began as a convenience of collecting these things. But then as they were collected, editors started to bring them together. And so one of the ways that they've done this is that there are actually connections between the beginnings of books and the endings of the previous book. And so this was definitely editorial work done at a late stage, because it seems to run throughout the 12 and that sort of thing. However, there is almost a narrative to the 12 if you read it from beginning to end. You begin with Hosea, and it's not chronological, but it's close to chronological. You begin with Hosea, which gives you this image of exile might be coming, but it also might not be coming. There's still an opportunity to turn and avoid exile. And even though Amos is chronologically earlier than Hosea, that ship has sailed in Amos. And so by the time you get to Amos, exile is certain. Of course, you have Joel in between there. Joel is a very interesting kind of piece in where it sits. There are references to every other book of the 12 in the book of Joel.
Oh, are there?
Yes. The least concrete would be between Habakkuk. But there are very concrete connections between Joel and every other book of the 12. And so it almost seems to be like an introduction to this book that you're reading.
Okay. Right, now you've plunked Joel in the middle of the, so he's from your point of view, he's average?
Yeah, well, I think he's got an important role, kind of the introductory kind of role. Of course, he's after Hosea. You know, I think pretty highly of pretty much all of these books, and so even though he's kind of in the middle of mine, yeah, there's some. You spend the first little bit talking about locusts. You know, it's not the most fun thing to read about. Of course, Joel has a very important position within the Christian tradition because Joel 2, it's Joel 3 in Hebrew, but Joel 2 in the English is the text for Peter's sermon in Acts chapter 2 at Pentecost. And so it stands at the birthday of the church. Joel, the end of chapter 2, is the beginning of the church. So they read that.
Hosea. I can't stand it. I don't like its opening imagery. Mm-hmm. I think it's misogynistic. I just find it repellent. Now I can understand the intellectual thing that's going on, but I just find it repellent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it definitely does have some misogyny in there, but several of the books do. Nahum has some misogynistic elements as well, and certainly don't want to apologize for the patriarchy and the misogyny there. But the narrative, the Hosea and Gomer narrative really becomes quite muted after chapter 3. Even some of the text seems to deconstruct the metaphor.
Oh, yeah.
And so you have Hosea 11. What's the verse? I should have it right in front of me. God declares, I am not a man. I am God and not a man. The word there is, like many languages, man can mean man or husband. And this whole text is, you kind of get an internal view of God there in Hosea 11, where he's wondering, what am I going to do with Israel? This is the out of Egypt I called my son, and the more I called them, the more they went after the Baals and that sort of thing. And God comes to the conclusion, at least momentarily, that I will not execute my fierce wrath because I am and not a human, not a man or not a husband. Hosea. So it has some. I agree with you, Gary. The front part has that misogynistic element to it.
Yeah, and I sort of just can't get over those opening chapters, regardless of the virtues of the rest of the book, sort of.
Right.
Weren't those the opening chapters, though? They'd screamed to me, at least, that they were metaphorical, and it's almost like the metaphor didn't even carry through the whole book.
It didn't. Yeah, no. Once you get to chapter 4, the metaphor's pretty much played out. And so whether or not, it's routinely been understood that Hosea does indeed marry Gomer, and it depends on your translation. A lot of translations just straight up call her a prostitute or a harlot. It might just mean someone who's prone to infidelity, but there are all kinds of fights about how to translate that. But one way or the other, whether it's metaphorical or not, it still has the misogynistic elements there. But certainly there are plenty of awful men in the text too, not just awful women.
Oh yeah.
Was that a common trope at the time? So much with harlotry and prostitution and comparing Israel to prostitution and all these metaphors of really running down the people. Was there a literary trope to that?
Yeah, and part of it is there's a religious element there too, is the Hebrew people were at least espousing a monolatrous or a henotheistic, not a quite full-blown monotheism where there's only one God, but only one God that they worship, whereas their neighbors, they all had these pantheons where prostitution was actually kind of part of fertility rituals and that sort of thing. And so there's a little bit of a kind of a line in the sand here type thing. It's prostitution is something that other people do, and we do not, because we have a singular deity that's asexual, at least in the Bible, though there are some interesting places where Yahweh has a wife in archaeological records. So not always asexual.
So there's always that of Hosea hanging out there. Now, we talked a bit about Zechariah, and we kind of skimmed over him. Is there anything else you'd like to mention about his book or the actual prophet?
We have a little bit more biographical info on Zechariah than we do for most, just because he appears in Ezra. So we can pinpoint him pretty closely. Sometime he was around, he gives, both he and Haggai actually give us specific dates. And that's in the five teens is when you can trace that to somewhere in that range. I don't have that in front of me. But Zechariah also kind of has an interesting place within Christian lore, because Jesus mentions Zechariah, saying that the blood of everyone from righteous Abel to Zechariah will be placed on this generation. That's not a story in the book of Zechariah about the martyrdom of Zechariah, but there was various what we call pseudepigraphal works about this, and so Jesus refers to it. Is supposed to be the same Zechariah that appears in our Old Testament, but that particular story that Jesus refers to is not in our Old Testament.
Oh, that's so interesting.
The martyrdom of Zechariah.
Yeah.
But Haggai and Zechariah are living at the time when the temple's being rebuilt.
Yes.
And think, well, who's going to martyr him? I mean, this is the recreation of the state of Israel. Well, not the state of Israel, the little kingdom of Yehud.
Right.
There's no Babylonians, no Assyrians. I mean,
well, there's Persia, but no, it's supposed to be.
Yeah, but Persia was nice.
Well, Persia wants you to think that they were nice.
Okay.
There's very little negativity towards Persia in the entire Bible, and that might be because the Persians were censoring anything that was negative about them.
Oh, that's interesting. This is also the time where Persia is having their little row with the Greeks too, kind of.
Yeah, pretty soon.
Yeah.
It's just it's the same king, so that first kind of trades blows. You have Darius the Great, or Darius, Doriavish, if you want to pronounce his name in Hebrew. But yeah, so he becomes king. I believe that's 523, 521, somewhere in there. And he's king for a long time. And so it is under his rule that Persia hits its zenith. Yeah, they have those first encounters with the Greeks. Though, of course, Xerxes is going to be, the encounters are going to be more substantial with Xerxes and Artaxerxes a little bit later, yeah.
As depicted in that historical documentary, 300.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, we also get in Zechariah, that was the one, Hasatan makes a little bit of a guest appearance.
Absolutely.
When this book's written, Hasatan's still a neutral character.
Or even a character that might be an agent of Yahweh. Satan becomes this diabolical character by the time of the New Testament, but here at Zechariah and also in Job is where you get probably the most vivid pictures of Satan and or Hasatan, the Satan. And he seems to be at home in the courtroom of Yahweh. A lot of times people will compare him as Satan's like the district attorney. It's his job to go after people.
Yes, I'm rather fond of Hasatan.
Yeah, you want to keep people honest. Of course, by the New Testament, Satan is, this diametrically opposed character that's, out in the wilderness tempting Jesus to do awful things and that sort of thing.
I mean, you can kind of see that their main characteristics are very similar. but their motivations change dramatically. And it's kind of a little bit outside of our realm here, but how does that change? So, it's not rapidly, but it does change significantly the motivations of Hasatan from neutral good guy to the evil one.
Right. Well, a lot of it has to do with, coming to terms with monotheistic claims. And so as the Israelite religion and what eventually becomes Judaism, we do distinguish between Israelite religion and Judaism. As it's progressing, it's becoming more and more monolatrous, where they only worship one deity. And then eventually you have claims, Isaiah and Jeremiah both make claims, there only is one deity, there only is one God. And so, what is the full implication of one God? And so, so if you are saying there's only one God, now you have a problem with explaining where evil comes from. And so there's certainly in Second Temple Judaism, and even definitely within Christianity, a dualism emerges to say, no, there's only one God, but there is this Satan figure. We're not going to call him a God. Functionally, there's not much difference here. But he's the author of evil and that sort of thing. Israelite religion earlier doesn't have that same problem because there are these forces of chaos in the world, and they're ultimately responsible for evil. But once you work closer and closer to a true monotheism, then you have to deal with that question: is our God the author of evil and good? So that's part of it. I just overly simplified the conversation quite a bit there. And of course, it takes hundreds of years for this to happen. It's not overnight.
I got a blank on Micah. I've forgotten everything about him.
That's a good thing we have an expert here.
It's good. It's a good thing we have an expert. Kipp, why don't you set up Micah there for us? Eh?
All right. Micah is the most complex book in the 12.
Ooh.
It is very complex. So the protagonist, the central figure, is identified as Micah from Moresheth, the Moreshite, and Jeremiah actually quotes Micah in Jeremiah 26, I believe it is. But this is our 8th century prophet who is a southerner to the southern kingdom, and both the prophet and the book serve kind of that important role as bringing the essential components of those 8th century prophets to the southern kingdom of Judah. Micah 1 has this kind of transition where you have Israel is receiving their just deserts for everything that they've done, and now we're pivoting and looking at Jerusalem. And Micah 3, I think it's 3:12, is where Micah prophesies that Jerusalem is going to be a heap and just a pile of ruins. This is the part that Jeremiah quotes, and they say, the people turned away from their wickedness and they listened to Micah, even though he was a prophet of doom. So there are so many pieces of Micah that are probably come in later. Micah 4 is almost certainly a quotation of Isaiah 2. The texts are almost identical, though interestingly enough, Micah 4 has some pieces that makes it look like it's aware of the whole book of Isaiah, which there's actually tons of little bits of Isaiah all throughout Micah. Kind of an interesting. Some people even describe Micah as the little Isaiah.
Never heard that before.
Yeah, well, that's kind of a phrase that gets passed around in scholarship, at least. I don't know if it's commonly used, but the little Isaiah, because he distills a lot of Isaiah's ideas and that sort of thing in a much shorter form than Isaiah, of course.
Now, does that have any implications for dating Micah, or does it fit in with what we already think we know?
Well, it does. It does, because Isaiah of Jerusalem, he fits, 8th century, long career, well into the 7th century. And Micah is just an 8th century, maybe the very beginning, so they would have been contemporaries. It wouldn't be extraordinarily difficult for Micah to quote Isaiah. But some of the pieces in Micah seem to be aware of the larger book of Isaiah, and quite a bit, well, really everything after Isaiah 40 is not Isaiah of Jerusalem. That's going to be...
that's right. The 3 Isaiahs, isn't there?
Right, yeah. 3 is the traditional model, but really, again, it depends on who you ask. It's could be many, many more than 3 even that are contributing to this book we call Isaiah.
So Micah seems to know Isaiah 1.
So the first Isaiah.
Yeah, the first Isaiah. Okay. Could they have known each other? Could Micah just be, dropping off to the coffee shop of Isaiah and taking a few notes?
Could be. Again, they're contemporaries. Isaiah lives in Jerusalem and seems to have the ear of the king, so he's kind of a bigwig compared to Micah, who's from tiny little Morashah. And so Micah would definitely be the country boy compared to Isaiah as the city, the person who has the ear of the king and that sort of thing. It was a small world back then. I think it's entirely possible that they knew each other.
Would there be any hint or clue in there or evidence that Micah could have been in some way Isaiah's disciple or a student or something like that?
Isaiah 8 does mention that Isaiah has students. So that's always open to possibility. I don't know if there's anything other than the little references to the book of Isaiah that would indicate that. But it's certainly possible.
All right, so we got the big one coming up, and probably the one that most people have at least some passing knowledge of a good chunk of the book, and that is Jonah.
Jonah, my favorite book.
Jonah is a literary masterpiece. I struggle between whether Amos or Jonah is the higher quality book, but Jonah is an extraordinary book. And it is designed to get you to ask questions of yourself, really. Really, the whole book turns in Jonah 4:2, which is where Jonah basically quotes Exodus 34, verse 6, where God shows up and says, "I am Yahweh, Yahweh, the gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness," which that's quoted in the Book of the 12 a bunch of times, the most explicitly there in Jonah 4:2. And Jonah says, "That's the whole reason I ran, because I knew you were this kind of God." And so the whole book, all the characters are stereotyped and then flip their stereotypes. There we go with that inversion again, as we were talking earlier. You begin the book with Jonah, who you get a little bit of biographical information in 2 Kings 14. He's, this prophet that's prophesies good things about Israel, and so he's kind of your all Israelite kind of prophet. He's the character you should be rooting for, and he turns out to be the lousiest character in the book. And you meet these sailors. Sailors shouldn't be known for their piety, but they're incredibly pious. And then you go to Nineveh, the capital city of this evil empire, and they're all contrite about their sins. And so, the last chapter of Jonah kind of gets you set up for, if you really believe this about God being gracious and compassionate, is God gracious and compassionate to other people too? Again, it's part of that larger conversation about Yahweh's relationship to the nations. And Jonah ends on a cliffhanger with a rhetorical question. It's almost not even a complete sentence, where God and Jonah are having this conversation, should I not care about the people of Nineveh, the great city? It has more than 120,000 people who don't know their right from their left, and many animals. And that's where it ends. You're supposed to step into Jonah's shoes and answer the question. Does God care about the people of the capital city of the evil empire?
Yes, it would have been the most despised capital on earth, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
For someone to say, hey, let's be compassionate about Nineveh. If you go, Death Star? No, let's not destroy it. It's fine.
Yeah, that's a good analogy there.
What do scholars think Tarshish was? An actual place, or kind of Jonah's going as far away in the opposite direction as he can possibly go?
Tarshish is mentioned a few other times in the Bible. And so it probably was a real place, but it's a literary trope in this case, is that far off place, as far away as possible as you can get, somewhere across the Mediterranean Sea when Jonah's supposed to be walking, up towards Assyria. He's getting on a boat, presumably a Phoenician boat, that's because those were the people who
sailed.
Tarshish might be a Phoenician colony, but really the location of the reality of Tarshish really matters very little to the book of Jonah. It's just, that place way far away.
And that kind of is an inversion too. He's supposed to walk to the east, and he winds up taking a boat to the west.
Absolutely.
And then the big fish, obviously, that's oftentimes translated as whale. Is that just another thing that maybe the author saw a big fish and wanted to include it somehow, or is there a literary trope in that?
I don't think there's necessarily anything about it being a fish, but it definitely serves an important part of the story, because we've got to get Jonah back to Nineveh. We have to have, and there's all kinds of wonderful rabbinic literature about this fish and that sort of thing. But in essence, this is Jonah's experience of the underworld, is the belly of the fish, and you go through that in Jonah 2. And so this is, in a way, and this is, Jesus even uses this to point to resurrection. That's kind of appropriate given Jonah's own discussion of the fish. This is supposed to be the underworld, but the fish ends up vomiting him out on dry land. Gets our narrative back on track.
So there is definitely a part of a plot element there to get us from A to B.
Yes, it's very, the fish has an important part of the plot, yeah. Because if Jonah just walks to Nineveh, then it's not quite the same story.
That's true. But unfortunately, almost everybody knows about Jonah is the fish.
And then the end,
yeah. And the whole point of the book is just completely missed.
Yes, it's very... very uncommon for you to see depictions of the book of Jonah that actually get the point of Jonah. Of course, this is usually in children's Bibles and that sort of thing, right? Which might leave out chapter 4 altogether or something like that. But chapter 4 is really the heart of the message of the book.
I think that Jonah was really it was my favorite book, because reading it as a total layman, it has a narrative arc to it.
Very clear narrative, yeah.
Which I think that made it interesting. But then all those cliffhangers and all of that, these points where you think to yourself, why is Jonah so invested in seeing Nineveh go down in flames?
Well, just read Nahum. Nahum.
Yeah.
Well, again, it's all of the characters in Jonah are chosen for their stereotypes. We got this really great prophet who turns out really bad. We've got this most evil empire that turns out to be kind of the good guys.
Yeah. I think that's what's fascinating about that book, is it really does flip everything on its head. And then last but not least, we have Amos. Tell us something about Amos.
Well, I've mentioned Amos a few times. Amos is a preacher's preacher. He knows how to turn a phrase. He knows rhetoric. Amos, and I think y'all talked a little bit about this when y'all covered Amos. Amos opens, and if you're not attuned to this, it kind of seems dreary when you have all of these other nations condemned. It's really one big rhetorical trap You have all of the people listening to Amos there, and he's condemning these other nations, near nations. And in fact, if you track geographically, he keeps getting closer and closer and closer to Israel. And then in chapter 2, he says, basically, and the Israelites, they're the worst. And so here you have all these people that he's built up, and then all of a sudden he turns on them and says, you're the worst, basically. At that point, you have that's how you make a point, is you build something up and then you smash it. And he just turns so many phrases. It's wonderful how he uses catchphrases that people probably would have known. He, at one point in chapter 4, he says, "Come to Bethel," which is like this, convocation almost, and sin. Well, that's not what we were expecting. It'd be kind of like, you started out, with familiar words at like a wedding, dearly beloved, we're gathered here today. And then you totally twist it, to light something on fire, something like that. So he uses these catchphrases to really drive his point home. And there's not as much structure to the entire book. There's a little bit. It's it appears to be kind of a few different sermons kind of tacked to each other. The first one being Amos 1 and 2. Amos 3 seems to be kind of its own coherent thing. Amos 4 seems to be a collection of a few different sayings. Amos 5 is probably the most famous chapter in Amos, at least here in the United States, because Martin Luther King quotes Amos 5. Let justice roll down like an ever-flowing stream. And the point of that is actually a similar point that Zechariah makes. Is he's just gone on about, he even says, I hate your religious festivals. I want no part of your music. All of these things that kind of make up the religious apparatus, because they're oppressing the poor. They're oppressing people. And if you're going to do that, go worship some other deity, not Yahweh. Because Yahweh cares how you treat the poor and the widow and the orphan. So just stop with all of this fanfare and these religious expressions, which actually fit Martin Luther King's point quite well, his speech. But then, you get a few more words that might be kind of an independent sermon or independent speech. In 6 and 7, you transition to the vision sequences, where Yahweh gives Amos these visions, and Amos says, "Oh Lord, let it not be. How can Jacob stand? He's so small." And Yahweh keeps saying, "This will not be," because Amos stepped in. But then, kind of in the middle of Amos 7, you have the classic confrontation between prophet and priest. Where the priest Amaziah comes and tells Amos to get out of town. He doesn't like what he's been preaching, which makes sense if you're a priest. Amos has basically told people to stop participating in the cult, stop participating in the temple and all these things that really benefit a priest. So Amaziah feels quite threatened, and so we almost come to blows. Amos 8 is an interesting chapter because it almost seems like it's a summary of the whole book. You have lots of little catchphrases from the entire book of Amos kind of pooled there in Amos chapter 8. But there's one more vision in Amos chapter 8 that belongs in that same sequence. And Amos chapter 9 gets back to the visions and has this wonderfully, complex kind of turn where, again, Amos is building up that idea of Israel's specialness, and then basically says, "You're not special. You're the same as the Ethiopians and the Philistines to me. I have a special relationship with each of these," which again is totally inverting what the people were expecting. The closing of Amos is almost certainly a later part of the book that was not by Amos probably at the level when these books were starting to be collected together, because they were collected in a Judean context. And Amos is a book to the north. So we have to include a few words about Judah right there at the end.
Wrapping it all up, it really seems that there were certain elements of the 12 that the Christians really latched onto. Mm-hmm. Especially like I guess even that there was 12 of them. Was there a significance to that number 12?
I think that's probably why it stops at 12. Of course, you don't get to 12 till you get the last book, which historically speaking, Jonah was almost certainly the last one to be included into the 12. But of course, 12 tribes of Israel and 12 apostles, it's a significant number. But, it kind of, once you got to 12 books, it probably served as a nice length, because it is pretty similar in length as of a scroll to Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah. It's a little bit shorter than those other three altogether, but it's close to the length of those. And so 12 is a significant number. I don't think they just stopped because they got to 12. I mean, that's probably part of it, but also they probably couldn't fit much more on the scroll anyway.
Why do you say that Jonah, you think, was the last to be included as an editorial decision?
Yeah, so the book, well, there's a few things. Jonah actually appears at the end of the Book of the 12 in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts.
Oh, okay.
After Malachi. And so it doesn't get its position until a little bit later. It also, I think I mentioned how the 12 is kind of woven together, probably where you have the little things that connect ends of books to the beginning of the next. And Jonah seems to actually break the mold a little bit.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, some people have said you can connect Obadiah to Micah better than you can intend. So Jonah might actually be disrupting an original flow that was there. But of course, you're going to have a whole bunch of disagreement about that. Part of it stands in pretty strong opposition to Nahum, right? Think about how different Nahum is, because they come down basically on opposite stance on this area, right? So there's a variety of things that kind of lead in that direction.
Actually, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, a lot of these little prophets contain rants against Israel's enemies who shall be righteously destroyed. Mm-hmm. And Jonah is just out of left field.
Just maybe to wrap it up, what's maybe something that's really exciting that's kind of getting you out of bed in the morning in your studies that you can maybe whet the listeners' appetite with?
Are there any new academic theories popping out of the woodwork or reinterpretations happening, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. There are all kinds of reinterpretations. The thing in biblical scholarship right now is what we call ideological criticism. It's where you essentially attune to some ideological perspective. So queer hermeneutics pay attention to what the text says from the perspective of an LGBTQ person. Feminist criticism has been around a little bit longer, but paid more attention to the perspective of the women in the text and that sort of thing. This is fairly, I guess it's been around for about 20-ish years now. There's an increasing focus on ecological criticism. What does the text have to say about the ecological crisis that we're currently in? How is the land a factor in the text itself? And it is. The land plays a huge role in Hosea in particular, because the land suffers because of the sins of the people. You have that in Hosea 4. There's this connection between the sin of the people and the suffering of the land. And so those are kind of the new developments, the way biblical scholarship is going these days. There's a lot of work this is more classical biblical scholarship. There's a lot of work being done in trying to trace out the order in which the Book of the 12 came together. And so there's there's not a lot of consensus, but there's a significant consensus that the first form of the Book of the 12 was actually Amos, Hosea, Micah, and Zephaniah.
Okay.
We definitely want to thank you so much for taking so much of your time to
thank you.
Talk with us and answer our hopefully semi-informed questions, informed-ish questions.